If you're Australian and thinking about offshore structures, there's one mistake that causes more audits, failed strategies, and unintended tax exposure than anything else: starting in the wrong country. So before you think about where to go offshore, you must understand how Australia sees you, because Australia is a jurisdiction that will fight hardest to keep you in its tax net. Hi, I'm Virna White, CEO of WellSafe, and today I want to talk about a jurisdiction that's often misunderstood in offshore structuring: the Isle of Man. The Isle of Man is not a bad jurisdiction, but in 2026, it is not a general offshore solution for most Australians. And when it's used incorrectly, it creates cost, complexity, and compliance risk without delivering real benefit. The Isle of Man is often marketed because it has a strong legal system, a respected regulatory environment, a long history in financial services, and zero or low corporate tax in certain cases. It sounds credible, it sounds safe, and that's exactly why it gets sold. But here's the issue. The Isle of Man is a specialist jurisdiction, not a general offshore solution. And when it's used as one, it creates complexity without proportional benefit. One of my clients, Sarah, is an Australian investor with significant capital, global investments, and a genuine desire to do things properly. She was advised to use the Isle of Man as a general holding and operating structure. On the surface, it looked respectable. But once we reviewed her situation, she was still Australian connected. She didn't operate a regulated financial business. She didn't require an insurance wrapper or fund structure. And she needed flexibility, not regulatory weight. For Sarah, the Isle of Man wasn't a solution, it was over-engineering. Here's the WellSafe perspective. First, the Isle of Man is a specialist jurisdiction. It excels in insurance structures, funds and collective investments, and regulated financial services. So if you're not operating in those areas, you're paying for capability you don't actually need. Second, cost and compliance overhead. Compared to other jurisdictions, setup costs are higher, ongoing compliance is heavier, and regulatory expectations are more complex. For most Australian founders and investors, this creates friction, delay, and unnecessary expense without corresponding upside. Third, and this is critical, the Isle of Man does nothing to resolve Australian tax residency, central management and control, or control foreign company exposure. So if those issues aren't addressed first, the jurisdiction choice becomes irrelevant. Finally, banking is not a shortcut. While the Isle of Man can support certain banking relationships, that only makes sense when the structure genuinely requires it, the client profile justifies it, and it forms part of a correctly sequenced plan. Using it just for banking is rarely efficient in 2026. This matters because we're not anti-jurisdiction. The Isle of Man can be appropriate when you're structuring insurance or reinsurance vehicles, you're operating a fund or collective investment structure, you require a highly regulated financial environment, and you have the scale and governance to justify it. In other words, specialized financial use, not general offshore structuring. That's a narrow professional use case. For clients like Sarah, we step back and ask, what function is actually required, where control should sit, what jurisdictions balance compliance with flexibility, and what will still work under audit in 10 years. We design structures from Australia outward with appropriate jurisdiction matching, proportionate compliance, and banking that supports real activity. Not overbuilt, not under-engineered, just fit for purpose. So here's the real lesson. In 2026, offshore structuring is not about choosing the most respectable sounding country. It's about correct use, correct sequencing, and correct scale. Jurisdictions like the Isle of Man are powerful tools, but only when used for what they're designed for. So if you're being sold a structure without a clear explanation of why that country, why that structure, and why that sequencing, then it's worth getting a second opinion. At WellSafe, we help Aussies move offshore legally, safely, and strategically, always from Australia outward with compliance at the centre. You can visit wellsafe.com.au to book a strategy session, because freedom isn't accidental, freedom is intentional, freedom is structured, freedom is built on compliance, freedom is designed.